First off, can everybody read the screen? Good. Do feel free to move forward if you need to. The aim of the next hour or so is to explore both what it means historically to be a bard, a poet, a worker of the verbal arts in ancient times in Celtic lands, but also trying to keep a little bit of a modern context as well, because people haven't ceased to compose poetry and tell stories and so forth in Ireland and Scotland and Wales. Part of this is going to be me waffling at you a little bit, part of it will be me subjecting you to poetry. But you were warned when you came along, so can't blame me on that one. So that's what we're going to do. Now, if we are thinking in terms of Celtic poetry, what on earth do we mean by Celtic? It's not quite as straightforward as it may seem, and that's how we're going to explore this issue. We could make the argument that Celtic identity, I'm not standing still enough, sorry, I keep forgetting about the cameras. I wander. Consists of language, blood, landscape, and faith. And we'll explore each of those themes as we go along. I should ask at this point, is anyone fluent in Gaelic? No? That's possibly a relief when I mispronounce everything shamelessly, because I intend to. There we go. If we're thinking in terms of understanding the role of language, the Bards of Wales, most people are familiar with the term bard, obviously from the Bard of Avon, as a composer of poetry, a worker of word craft. Fili is the Irish equivalent. It's essentially an Irish poet in the early medieval court. The Fili persisted in Ireland really up until the Norman conquest. The problems that we see still being discussed in Ireland to this very day, I'm not even going to mention the B word, borders, that being, not the other B word, that can be traced all the way back to the Norman invasion of Ireland and the setting up of the Pale, which was an area roughly around where Dublin is now. And when we have the phrase of beyond the Pale, that's where it stems from those people who are outside the great palisades that define the English enclosures in Ireland. Anyone on the wrong side of the fence was literally beyond the Pale. And it still is used in exactly the same context these days. There were the Fili beyond the Pale. There were those poets still working in Ireland, even as the Normans were imposing their presence there, even as we get into the times of Cromwell, who is heavily despised in Ireland for having massacred vast numbers of people. And worth noting that a lot of the early slaves in the Barbados were Irish. People who had been, a lot of them nuns, priests, who had been captured. People were paid per nun, paid per priest that they caught, who were then deported to places like the Barbados to work on the sugar plantations. As it transpired, a lot of them were a tad ginger, and we don't work well in heat. So that's why they eventually abandoned the idea of using Irish slaves, and as we all know, historically went on to exploit even vaster numbers of people from other parts of the world, or running the sugar plantations and so on. But those bards, those poets, those Fili, incorporated an awful lot of functions and tasks that we still know about because of some of the literature that was kept by the early monks, detailing the roles and the function and the purpose of the bards, who originated in pagan times but persisted well into the Christian period. Some of their functions were grammarians and historians. If I really wanted to bore you, we could go off on a discussion of when the first dictionary came into being. Because to have grammarians, you have to have an agreement on grammar. And if, as we're familiar with in the English language, up until the formation of the first English dictionary, people spelt things any damn way they felt like spelling them. There was no standardized form of spelling, it was very random. But in Ireland, we have a suggestion of an organized, structured grammar, a dictionary. But that's a discussion for another time. They were preservers of tribal histories. One of the least interesting forms of poetry that the bards and the Fili engaged in were what's referred to in Ireland as the fosunded. That is, funeral orations, where they would turn up to the funerals of the exceedingly rich. If you were poor, you just made do with Uncle Fred and a pint. But if you were exceedingly rich, they would turn up and recite the lineage of the deceased, going back as many generations as they possibly could, and not just a list of tedious names, but of the deeds and the actions of those ancestors both admired and those who were perhaps slightly more embarrassing, who were glossed over and spin-doctored. That's nothing new these days, that people have been doing that for thousands of years. Part of the reason they memorized these lineages and recited them wasn't just to impress people at funerals, but it also had a legal function, that you could work out who was related to who. So when somebody died, working out the inheritance was slightly more straightforward as to all of the interrelationships between people. But I will not be subjecting you to an example of full-sundered poetry because it is really dull. These days, when we're understanding the role of language in poetry, in Celtic poetry, are we talking poetry written in Irish, poetry written in Scots Gaelic, in Cornish, in Breton, in Manx? Arguably so. There are still people composing in all of those languages, not many admittedly in Cornish these days. It's the least numerous. It's even fewer speakers of Cornish than there are of Manx. And when you consider the size of the Isle of Man, that's saying something. It's one of the dying languages of the British Isles, unfortunately. For a poem to be classed as Celtic, does it have to be written in one of those languages? Because there are many people who are Irish born and bred for many, many generations who can barely string two words of Gaelic together. Does that make them less Irish than the people from the Gaeltacht who speak Gaelic fluently? If I learn to speak Gaelic fluently, does that make me more Irish than an Irish-born person who can't? It creates problems of identity, problems of rivalry between different groups, some of whom feel, yes, to call something a Welsh poem, it must be written in Welsh. And up until very recently, the Welsh National Eisteddfod insisted on all poetry being performed in Welsh, which alienated vast numbers of people who couldn't understand a word that was being said, including lots of Welsh people. Nowadays, they've relaxed that a little bit, and they allow the occasional speaker of some other language to have a presence on the Eisteddfod stage. So some of that does change. But to give you an example of how this works in practice, this is the start of a poem, the first verse, by Nualan Ní Nonal, who is a composer of Irish verse in Gaelic. So this is, well, obviously the translation. She doesn't do her own translations. She gets other people to do that for her. I'll read you the whole thing in a minute, but an example of something that works in Irish that doesn't work in English. This phrase that you've got underlined here of bright young thing, Bawn an Leisha. Bawn an Leisha is an Irish pun. It means both a bright young woman, but it also means a woman of the fairy folk. So you can understand this either as a young lady who turns up with a Black and Decker to chop down a quince tree, or you can understand it as a fairy woman emerging from the mounds of the Shee, one of the elven folk coming out to intrude upon her garden and chop down trees in her garden. So if you understand the pun of the language it's originally written in, you see a whole additional level of meaning to the poem you don't get just by reading the English translations. So, to give you the whole thing. As for the quince, there came this bright young thing with a Black and Decker and cut down my quince tree. I stood with my mouth hanging open while one by one she trimmed off the branches. When my husband got home that evening and saw what had happened, he lost the rag. As you might imagine, why didn't you stop her? What would she think if I took the Black and Decker round to her place and cut down a quince tree belonging to her? What would she make of that? Her ladyship came back the next morning while I was at breakfast. She inquired about his reaction, and I told her straight that he was wondering how she'd feel if he took a Black and Decker round to her house and cut down a quince tree of hers, etc., etc. Oh, says she, that's very interesting. There was a stress on the very, and she lingered over the ing. She was remarkably calm and collected. These are the times that are in it. So, all a bit topsy-turvy, the bottom falling out of my belly as if I had got up a kick up the arse or a punch in the kidneys, a fainting fit coming over me that took the legs from under me and left me so zonked I could barely lift a finger till Wednesday. And as for the quince, it was safe and sound and still somehow holding its ground. You don't want to know the original word that was translated to zonked. It doesn't go well in Irish. It's her exploration of this idea of, is it a woman cutting down the tree? Is it a fairy intruding on daily life? And that's not just a play on words. You could argue it's an embodiment of the Irishness of the poetry, that there is a permeation of the boards between the living and the non-human, and the dead. Within Irish, the term she is generic for a fairy of either sex, male or female. The Barn and Lecture is specifically female. The word she not only means a fairy, it also means a burial mound, one of the old Iron Age burial mounds. Some of them even date back to the Neolithic. And there are lots of myths and traditions that every Samhain, which in English is Halloween, the she open their gates, the doors of the mounds of the dead open up and out ride the fairy folk. Now we know that when a lot of these, not this particular poem, but a lot of the early poems were being composed, those mounds were still open and still being used to inter fresh bodies. So they knew perfectly well there were corpses in them. So there's this fusion in Irish culture between the dead and the fairy folk, and when one becomes the other. You get a very similar fusion in Scandinavian cultures, where a lot of Scandinavian traditions, particularly back in the times when people tended to live on the same farmsteads that their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers had lived on, and had the generation after generation of relatives buried on the farmland, that those ancestors became huldra. They became nocturnal spirits that watched over the family and watched over the cattle and watched over the crops and looked after people. They became these elven beings that were not wholly human, but not wholly dead. They were something else, somewhere in between the living and the dead. Sometimes they're referred to as deities, as gods. And again, there is a blurring of the barrier between where does an ancestor end and a deity begin. Certainly in pagan times, it gets very, very blurred and confused, and they intrude upon life. They turn up and they do things that you don't necessarily want them to do. They make your life awkward and difficult, whether by chopping down your trees or by doing something else again. And as per the last two lines about the quince somehow still holding its ground, that's an allusion to an attack upon the Irish language and how it somehow still holds its ground, despite the best efforts of people to stamp it out. This is Ceolas Sharkey, who, what page are we on? 25. Wrote an awful lot of poems, all of them in the Irish language, translated by various other people. I won't give you the Irish version because there'll be spit everywhere. It's a very flingy language. I'll give you the English translation of Lament. It's from this book by the Hearth and Minna, which again starts out as a reflection on one thing, but ends up as a reflection on another. And you could argue that's very characteristic of an awful lot of Irish and Welsh and so on poetry. If you think of knotwork, the way lines weave in and out of each other on artistic knotwork, you start in one place and you end up in another. The imagery flows in and out, so you're never quite sure what you're talking about at any one point in time. So, Lament. I cried on my mother's breast, cried sore the day Molly died, our old pet ewe. Trapped on a rock face up at Behy, it was sultry heat. We'd been looking for her, sweating and panting, driving sheep back from the cliff edge when we saw her attacked, on a ledge far down. Crows and more crows were eating at her. We heard the cries, but couldn't get near. She was ripped to death as we suffered her terrible, wild last breath, and my child's heart broke. I couldn't be calmed, no matter how much she tightened her arms around me and gathered me close. I just cried on till she hushed me at last with a piggyback and the promise of treats of potato cake. Today it's my language that's in its throes, the poet's passion, my mother's father's mother's language, abandoned and trapped on a fatal ledge that we won't attempt. She's in agony. I can hear her heave and gasp and struggle as they arrive, the beaked and ravenous scavengers who are never far. Oh, if only anger came howling wild out of her grief, if only she'd bare the teeth of her love and rout the pack. But she's giving in, she's quivering badly, my mother's gone, and promises now won't ease the pain. So a very fundamental sense of the attack on the Irish language itself being spoken by fewer and fewer people as English becomes increasingly standardized as the language of government. We could trace back to the history of attempts by London to outlaw the speaking of Welsh, the speaking of Irish, the speaking of Cornish in a lot of different regions, and to insist the language of administration, the language of government in those parts of the kingdoms could only be conducted in English. And so if you wanted to get married, if you wanted to go to court, if you wanted to get, well, not in Ireland, divorced obviously, but in Wales, you had to get all of the forms filled in a language you might barely understand. In fact, in a language, you'd probably have to pay someone to explain to you and pay through the nose to have this essentially foreign language explained to you so you could just work within the systems of government. So it's a form of control, it's a form of domination. And so people who insist on still writing poetry in Irish and in Welsh aren't just doing it for the fun of doing it. You could argue it's an act of defiance. It's a statement of national identity, that this is what I am going to write in, this language of my people, for my people. And if English speakers can't read it, or Spanish speakers, or Japanese speakers, or whatever can't read it, they can pay for the translation. This becomes a way of asserting and promoting national identity in the face of not just a hostile government, but often people sensing that the younger generations of their own family really don't care, really aren't that bothered if they don't understand much Irish, they don't speak much Welsh, they don't speak 2 words of Cornish. It's no longer a matter of national pride to be preserved. So not only are they fighting wider forces of social difficulty, but they're fighting apathy in their own families, that there is no one to pass the language on to. We could think about issues of blood. How Welsh do you have to be to count as truly Welsh? For that matter, how Suffolk do you have to be to count as truly Suffolk? I've been here 25 years and I'm still not Suffolk. I'll probably be here till I'm 90 and still won't be classed as a local. If someone is born in Wales, does it make them Welsh? If their parents were born in Wales, their grandparents, their how far back do you have to go to be truly Welsh? If you're in the mood to go and burn down somebody's holiday cottage because you resent these English people buying up local land, taking it away from your friends, your family, your neighbours and their ability to buy property locally, is it just recent arrivals you resent, or is it people who've still been living there a generation, or 2 generations, or 3 generations? Are they still basically foreigners that you want out, or do you accept and embrace them as locals? There's no clear-cut answer to that. It's perversely rhetorical. If we go back into history, the old bards, the old Fili, were the preservers of culture. A lot of the poetry commemorates storytelling. So you get stories told in the forms of poetry. And there's a lot of evidence that many of those poems were originally intended to be sung rather than recited. You don't need to worry, I'm not going to attempt to sing at you. I can barely carry a tune in a bucket. So you're safe on that one. Likewise, there's lots of evidence that much of the Scandinavian poetry we get coming out of Sweden and Denmark and Norway and so on was originally sung at banquets, delivered in an almost Wagnerian style, rather than just somebody standing up there reading off a manuscript. It's music rather than pure word. And there is very little difference, if you think about it, between poetry and lyric. It's practically the same thing. So they preserved the stories of their people, the stories of kings and queens, the stories of warriors, the stories of ancient gods, in slightly more recent times, the stories of saints and bishops and other significant figures. The poetry becomes a means of conveying that to another generation, a means of keeping those stories, those traditions alive. To give you an example of a poem, this one is a Welsh poem by Hilary Llewellyn Williams, of poetry that weaves wild imagery from mythology into a more modern context. And it's that kind of keeping the old stories alive. So this is, does everybody know what a changeling is? I should ask that first. If anyone doesn't, it's a child stolen away by the fairies and replaced by something that looks like a child but isn't, and grows up to be very, very strange. Some of you may have one of those at home. So, changeling. The marriage of wood and water spawned this creature. Wood chromosomes and water chromosomes juggled together, shaping a wizened femur, as if an old ivy woman tossed her leg bone to the elements and the waves took it, to scour the moss and the dirt away, then rolled it back to shore. There are faces in it, gargoyles, gurnings, the grin of a running dog, an ivy dog running from tree to tree, a sea dog cocking its leg, at the suck slick of the tide that whittled it, by the push and pull of the moon, wood and water and the lunar carver conjuring a fake, a changeling brat, a beglamoured stock outwardly whole, but inwardly skewed like this. I'd love to see the rest of the skeleton, the ribcage opening its shriveled petals, the pelvis writhing in exuberant loops, the skull. What would they make of the skull? The one true giveaway, that careful smoothing of flesh cannot disguise. And of course, it was by the eyes you knew them inhuman. The goblin urge to recreate, to play with blocks of DNA to make believe, and we are part of the game. So an ivy stem can mimic a thigh bone, and our veins web out like a tree, with the sea moving in rhythm through us, casting us back along with other flotsam, wood bones and shells in the tidal reaches. And who comes combing the beaches for what remains of us? She's a very good poet. It's that sort of interweaving of lots of themes, lots of ideas from the world of fairy, the world of folklore, the world of legend, and not being ashamed of it. It's easy to start thinking of mythology, especially if you are moving from a rural culture to a more urbanized culture, that this is the strange stuff that people in the sticks still think. And we urbanites don't think like that anymore, and it becomes something to be slightly embarrassed about, that your toothless old great-grandmother used to do, but you don't do anymore. This is saying no. The fairy, the magical, the strange, the spectral is still very much here and now in a world of DNA and chromosomes. It's not just something of the distant past. Another one by Nuala. This is called Maeve Speaks. For anyone who's unfamiliar, Queen Maeve is a character from Irish myth. Possibly was a historical queen at some point. But in the telling and the retelling, she's turned into this huge mythical figure. For those of you who remember Dynasty, think Joan Collins with an Irish accent. She is much married, she gets around, and she schemes and she plots and she backstabs and she wraps all of the men of the court around her little finger and gets up to all manner of shenanigans. She's buried at the top of Crochnaria, which is a mountain in Ireland. I've been up it. Well, it took a while, but I got up there eventually. At the top, there is a huge pile of boulders and stones, big stones and little ones. The tradition being, just as in Judaism, if you visit a grave, you take a pebble and leave it on the grave. So in Ireland, in Scotland, when you visit the grave of someone you admire or you love, you take a stone, even a small stone, the size doesn't matter, and you leave it and you pile it up. So those who are hugely popular have great, massive mounds, and people no one gives a damn about anymore, have two old pebbles sitting on their graves. So you understand the significance of the person by the size of the mound heaped upon their grave. It is a sort of fusion of both Maeve in the ancient world, but also a statement that might appeal to more modern people, especially women. War I declare from now on all the men of Ireland, on all the corner boys lying curled in children's cradles, their willies worthless, wanting no woman, all macho boasting. Last night they bedded a Grecian princess, a terrible war I will declare, merciless war I declare, endless, without quarter, on the 20-pint heroes who sit on besides me, who nicely put their hands up my skirt, no apology or reason, just looking for a chance to dominate my limbs. A merciless war I will declare. I will make incursions to the fertile land of Ireland, my battalions all in arms, my Amazons besides me, not just to steal a bull, not over beasts this battle, but for an honour price, 1,000 times more precious, my dignity. I will make fierce incursions. An honour price you also get in Anglo-Saxon cultures back in ancient times. Each person had their own worth, their own sense of honour and dignity, which had a financial value placed upon it. So if somebody injured you or insulted you or attacked you or even murdered you, they had to pay a price. In the first instances to you, and obviously if they murdered you, not to you, it'd be a bit pointless, wouldn't it? but they had to pay that price to your family. So one person might be worth 10 times more, literally 10 times more financially than another person, because they were considered of higher status. A doctor was worth more than a dustman, basically, in Ireland and in Saxon times. So your worth was partly determined by your social class, snobbery is nothing new, but also by your profession, by your trade. A bishop was worth more than a monk. So if you killed a bishop, it would cost you an awful lot more to pay to the church than if you just killed a monk, where you could just chuck a few coins and that would be the end of it. Ireland and Wales and Scotland did not have a penal system until very, very late. They did not lock people up in prisons. By and large, they imposed fines, even for the most serious of offences. And those who couldn't afford to pay the fines and had no relatives to club together to pay the fines on their behalf were sold off into indentured labour, and the money raised by selling their labour was used to pay the fines. They could eventually buy their way to freedom again. But once you were indentured, you got paid a wage, but it was roughly equivalent to minimum wage these days, hardly worth having. So it took you forever and a day to buy your way to freedom again. But that was the chosen form of punishment rather than imprisoning people or executing them. That was by far the most common form of punishment that was used. This other one, First Day at the Bog, what page are we on? Is by Michael O'Sullivan, an Irish writer. It's from this collection, Cuam. This is a memory of him as a child, thinking of his day, first day out. For those of you who've been to Ireland, you possibly might, if you've been to one of the more old-fashioned houses, might have smelt a peat fire burning, where they cut the peat, dry it out, and burn it in lumps. It's a wonderful smell. The downside is, of course, they're running out of peat to dig up. So much of it goes on fueling vast furnaces and industrial level of heating that a lot of smaller families, particularly those on a low income, struggle now to heat their homes. So whilst over here we talk about heating or eating as the dilemma with fuel poverty, in a lot of the older Irish houses, they still have fireplaces. So if they can't afford to run the radiators, they can find stuff to burn. But the tradition is to burn peat rather than wood or coal or anything of that sort. So this is a memory of him out with his father cutting peat. A bead of sweat hit every third sod, piked wet and settling from crisp dry heather, replaced as it was lifted by another black loaf. The schlorn bothered 5,000 years of blanket. We stopped at last, reward for the morning's suffering. I raised my back to pain that would last forever, a small boy in short pants feeling very old. Coarse brown wrappings held bread, tea and sugar. An onion bag had stout for the men, an orange for the lad. Throw a crippin in the tea, my dad demanded. The age-old huddle round the crackling flame discussed the morning's progress and greater things. My eyes focused on the battle of smoke and steam as the gallon neared the boil. When I was in America, Johnny Bezzard claimed, North of Carolina would show you weather, tornadoes and lightning you'd never see here. My backside shifted on its sphagnum cushion. Bogdale from Lyre and antlers from Fowl, the mail reflected us warm sun as Boglaw intruded in near-forgotten pain. Donkeys with wicker baskets became kings. The man I had known all my life emptied the last of the tea in my grey panee. I can feel his hand rest on my shoulder, hear him whisper, "You'll sleep tonight, my boy." So it's not just preserving ancient history, tales of queens and dragons and elves and gods and so on. It's preserving more recent history through poetry, through story, through song, keeping them alive, keeping them in understanding. And Johnny Bezzard, who is remembering his time in Carolina, is a reference to the million-odd Irish who emigrated during the potato famine. A lot to America, but also Canada and Australia and other places. Out of a population of 6 million, 1 million starved to death, and another million got on ships and went wherever they could go. So that was a massive drop in population. All the while, there was enough food in Ireland to feed everyone. They just hoarded it, or more to the point, the rich hoarded it and refused to give it to the poor. If you're at all interested in that period of Irish history, the soup kitchens were not run by the Catholic Church, they were run by the Quakers in Ireland. whilst the British government under the Whigs at the time, particularly influenced by an economist called Thomas Malthus, who was also a vicar as well as an economist, argued that if you help the poor by feeding them, it just makes them damned lazy. So you should leave them to starve, and it will encourage them to get off their backsides and get a job. So it's, some political opinions do not change. They just get re-echoed and re-echoed and re-echoed. But they did get help from other quarters, not from the British government, who didn't give a damn, but they got help from the Choctaw Indians, who held a massive fundraising and sent money over to Ireland, having read about it in the newspapers, and from the Sultan of Turkey. So help came from unexpected sources, just not from the nearest country, or even from half their own people. We could think about landscape and the role of growing up in Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, in Cornwall, surrounded by landscapes that fill the mind. This is Llantegid in Wales, well, specifically in Anglesey. And there's all sorts of myths and traditions about a great tower that once stood there, was dwelt in by the goddess of the moon, by Ceridwen, and who inspired the great bard Taliesin, who's one of the more famous bards of medieval Wales and Ireland. Part of the job of the bard and the Fili in early times was to celebrate landscape. There are countless poems celebrating mountains and rivers and lakes, of deer and wolves and blackbirds and all manner of creatures, of seeing the land as a holy, living, spiritual being of which humanity is integral. And it's worth bearing in mind that even though we're talking about the English and the Irish and the Welsh, this part of the world was as Celtic as any other part of the world if you go back far enough to the days of Boudica and so on. It's only become separated and acquired a different identity as the result of politics and transition and time. Genetically, there are still an awful lot of people in this country who can trace their ancestry back to the Neolithic. They just haven't changed very much in all sorts of ways, possibly, in that time. So not only does a lot of ancient poetry celebrate the landscape and the beauties of growing up in these locations, so does a certain amount of modern poetry. So back to Ceolas Sharkey. This one is Mountain Pulse, which, because he grew up in Ireland, still lives in Ireland, he grew up in one of the more mountainous parts of Ireland and is remembering his childhood near the mountains and the passion and the mystery and the magic of being around the mountains. And it does, again, this poem, mix in not only landscape, but myth, tradition, spirituality. So, Mountain Pulse. Walking in the majesty of the mountains over towards Bay, not a hide nor hair of anyone in sight or earshot, he suddenly felt as he crossed the Avon Vin Avada, as if something swelled in the pit of his stomach. He was in the company of the Muse, not in the form of a vision, but the way a dog knows a sacred place. That's how he knew. The Muse was near him. Then his face set like it was crystal, and reason was sidetracked. With every glance, the mountain turned magical. The blue-faced sky laughed out loud, and dashing newts of rain ran cool and fresh through the curls in his hair, innocent as babies. Every sound was sweet-mouthed, the silence teeming with life. Then, like a bow steering over coral strings, the lilting music of his voice rose from the mind's abyss and carried him away to unwalled Parnassus. He bent and kissed the wet neck of the mountain, the weeping breasts of Breed, mountain goddess Muse, a drink to his taste, filled with a strange sweetness that turned him on until he felt the little heart in his breast rippling and reaching, spreading out boldly and miraculously, clinging to the mountain, flesh to flesh. Now, when he speaks out in poetry, he speaks as never before, wildly, wholeheartedly, from the heart of the mountain. It's a little shame he has to include a reference to Parnassus rather than one of the native sources of mythical tradition. But again, perhaps that idea that even his own Irish reading audience won't know half the stories that he could be referring to. But there we go. Brige is the goddess of fire and poetry in Ireland. She has a direct link to Saint Bridget. They share a feast day, a holy day. And Saint Bridget, as well as being a patron saint of many other things, is also the patron saint of poetry in Irish Catholicism. She was slightly demoted a few decades ago to an optional saint. on the basis that she may possibly not have existed and she was ever so slightly pagan. But we'll gloss over the internecine politics of the church. This one, slightly longer poem, is called Watching You Sleep. It's the poet on one of his travels into London picked somebody up for a one-night stand, and this is him memorising it. It doesn't get too graphic. It's him memorising that experience and comparing the body to the land and seeing a total fusion between body and landscape, which is a constant repetition of theme throughout both early Irish Christianity and even earlier Irish paganism. The fact that humanity and landscape are not separate things. We are the land is us. So, Watching You Sleep. Tonight, if it was up to me, sonny boy, I'd be travelling all over the four corners of your body. Here as you border onto me, all warm and sleepy in your private kingdom, tucked up tight in a continent of quilt. The sturdy promontory of your leg stretches out, my love, over a seascape of floor, turning me on, tempting me, killing me. Oh, I'd give all I have and more to be a salmon swimming in your river mouth, lolling and licking over your rocky teeth. Stretched out before me like a strange, forbidding land, I want to go over you from the sweeping locks of your eyes to your sunny, sloping cheeks, from the rich plains of your chest to the amber yellow of wheat fields, down secret, narrow passageways to there where nature's remedy lies, my healing. Oh, I'd like to live my life checking you out, my love, from your headland to the bare fault islands of your toes, even though you're only small, only one small part of the world. Tonight, with you lying on the slope of your back, I can see that the world of you is wide. Too wide to appreciate in just one lifetime. The coasts and curves, the hills and vales of you. Even though you are only small, you are boundless, limitless. Your earthy scent will always linger in my memory, and your name, sonny boy, will whirl my senses like a river, swell over them like a mountain. He does like his mountains. So again, that fusion of land and body, of sensuality, of sexuality, of there being no distinction between one and the other. You don't get that sort of Puritanism that we're more used to in later forms of Christianity and later forms of poetic tradition, where some things cannot be spoken about. Which brings us on to faith. Do we define Celtic identity by what people believe in? In which case, which set of beliefs? Because there isn't just one nice, neat box to tick on that one. If we go back to ancient times, we have the Druids and the bards and the composers of ancient poetry celebrating the old gods and the kings and the heroes and the queens and so on of the ancient world. But equally, you can describe early Irish Christianity as particularly Celtic with its approach to the teachings of Pelagius before they were stamped out and declared heretical. You can look at the Chaldees that were prominent in Scotland as an example of Celtic Christianity. You can leap forward a chunk in time and think of the Wee Free Church, where you can if you're suffering from insomnia, with their rather severe approach to absolutely everything. And their very, very severe approach to poetry. To celebration, to music, to dance, all of the things you can't possibly have, because let's face it, you might enjoy yourself. Which particular form of Celtic Christianity, Celtic paganism, Celtic belief are we talking about? And if, let's say, you've got a Jewish family that have been living in Ireland for 5 generations, can you talk about Irish Judaism? The way we talk about Irish Christianity? How do we define identity? How do we define the fusion between nationality and spirituality? Is it even a valid conversation to be having? Possibly. This is one I wrote. Here. This is based upon a Welsh metrical form, the Beir y Thodaid. The Welsh bards, the medieval ones that is, were expected to memorize 24 different poetic meters and to be able to compose in any single one of them on command. So you could, not a king or a queen could go up to their bard and say, "Oi, you, I want a poem about haddock composed in Englyn Milur and I want it by Thursday." And they had to deliver if they needed to earn their money. This, I should add, is back in a day and age when if your teenager came to you and said, "Mum, I want to be a poet when I grow up, you would have rejoiced. You would have been counting the cash. Because back in that day and age, they were very well paid. So it was a lucrative profession to be getting into. These days, you just kind of go, oh, God, can't you get a proper job? But, back then, it was slightly different. So this is inspired by Welsh mythology. It's the story of Blodeuwedd, who is made out of flowers. She's conjured up from a cauldron filled with flowers to create a wife for someone who has a curse laid upon him, a prince called Llai. Llai cannot get married because his mother has cursed him. It's families. So he can't marry a human woman, which is why they have to make a woman out of flowers. But if you want to have a modern twist upon this, nobody actually asks her, does she want to be married off to Llai? And that's where the problem sets in, because she finds other interests, other lovers. And eventually there's a huge myth in A Song and a Dance, and eventually she gets caught and turned into an owl. Because having been made out of flowers, she's grown up in the light of the sun and loves the sun. So her punishment is to become a creature of the night, where she can never see the sun again. So this is before the owl takes flight. Let your sap rise up in greeting of the tender light so fleeting. Bright the blossoms of the broom, sweeping fresh joy, golden boy, future groom. Old Marth's words the earth does waken, flowers from their slumber shaken. Winter's brittle tomb cracks with painful sigh, a butterfly starts her reign. Time does youth its bright colours fleece, from the gods we our rainbow lease. Unfurl your petals whilst the sky can see such beauty, be not shy. Decaying winter exercise with rich perfumes and lovers' sighs. Nodding heads of flowers beat life's rhythm, with them languid bees meet. Honeyed love blooms beneath the sun, yet wilts without its chosen one. Growing free, she is savoured best of all. What fool plucks her in jest? When the light is gone, what remains? Bloodless, spectral, white shadow stains the bower through which the ghostly owl sails, wails in the night, pale host. Cavort with her whilst she is here, treasures blossom like jewels dear. When all is grey and the white owl swoops low, know that the dawn brings light. Some poetry, the older traditions, the medieval forms, are rhyming and rhythmical, unlike Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon poetry, which relies on alliteration. A lot of the modern poetry is free verse, which is sometimes just a euphemism for bad verse, but occasionally is good verse too. The deep peace poems, many of you might be familiar with. It's often used in churches, particularly for saints' days associated with Celtic saints. It was collected in the late Victorian period by a chap called Alexander Carmichael. No one knows who actually composed it first. He was the first to publish it, but he didn't write it. He travelled the highlands and islands of Scotland, talking to farmers and crofters and what have you, writing down their poems, their songs, their hymns, their chants, and discovered a culture which was predominantly illiterate, but which had a vast memory for songs and poetry, even though they were unable to read any of them in paper form. So he collected them because he was afraid that as they were all about 90 and dying off, their poems would go with them. Their songs and their hymns would go with them. So his intention, and you get similar people in Lithuania, in Poland, in Russia, collecting the dying tales of rural peoples and preserving them and presenting them to a predominantly literate middle-class urbanite audience of this is what the country folk do. And there's a whole sort of weird context to that one as well. But this particular poem, the Camina Gadelica, is a massive collection of songs and hymns and so forth. This one has remained particularly popular. Deep peace I breathe into you. Oh, weariness here, oh, ache here. Deep peace, a soft white dove to you. Deep peace, a quiet rain to you. Deep peace, an ebbing wave to you. Deep peace, red wind of the east from you. Deep peace, grey wind of the west to you. Deep peace, dark wind of the north from you. Deep peace, blue wind of the south to you. Deep peace, pure red of the flame to you. Deep peace, pure white of the moon to you. Deep peace, pure green of the grass to you. Deep peace, pure brown of the earth to you. Deep peace, pure grey of the dew to you. Deep peace, pure blue of the sky to you. Deep peace of the running wave to you, deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the sleeping stones to you. Deep peace of the yellow shepherd to you. Deep peace of the wandering shepherdess to you. Deep peace of the flock of stars to you. Deep peace of the Son of peace to you. Deep peace of the heart of Mary to you. The yellow shepherd being the sun and the wandering shepherdess the moon. Christian poem, Christian context, but filled with the kind of imagery that St. Francis would thoroughly have approved of and embraced, and which goes back to that ancient Celtic tradition of incorporating the land, of nature, of animals, of constellations and features of the world around us into a spiritual context. A lot of the poetry in the Commedia Gadelica follows that sort of repetitive pattern of having the same opening lines, the same opening contexts. St. Kevin and the Blackbird is by Seamus Heaney, so a much more modern style of poem, and celebrates an old... St. Kevin, you may think Kevin is a made-up saint. It sounds a bit the patron saint of teenagers or something. But Kevin is an English translation of an old Gaelic name. So there really is a St. Kevin. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell. But the cell is so narrow. So one turned up palm is out to the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked, neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks, until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing's imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he, self-forgetful or in agony all the time? From the neck on out down through his hurting forearms, are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head, alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river? To labour and not to seek reward, he prays. A prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the river bank, forgotten the river's name. Goes back to an old story that St. Kevin literally was. The monastic cells of the time, beehive cells, you could just about fit one very skinny monk in if you folded them up a bit first. And so in attempting to stand up, he is literally putting his arms out the windows. It's that small. It's like being in a cupboard or something. And a bird lands upon his hand, and he is so compassionate, he will not disturb the bird for weeks and weeks and weeks as it nests on his hand. And he essentially becomes a tree. You've got things like the Anglo-Saxon Rood poem, which again refer to the cross of crucifixion as the tree. So he is emulating both the tree in the usual sense, the tree in the woodland, as an ancient Celtic image, but he's also emulating the cross on which Christ is crucified. And so the bird landing upon him is a nesting element. And you could reflect, those of you who like Oscar Wilde, and who doesn't, except Oscar Wilde's wife, but that's another story. You could reflect on the story of the Happy Prince, with the starling flowing out, carrying the gold stripped from the prince's statue, of him rigid in place but sending his compassion out via a bird. Was Oscar inspired by this story? He was an incredibly literate man. He knew an awful lot of church law, church traditions, not to mention Irish, Scottish and other traditions. So he may well have been very, very familiar with St. Kevin and been inspired by that story to create his own version. Which one are we on now? Oh, yes, this one. Or not. I'm getting slightly used to that. Okay, one to finish on? Is that one? Or do you want me to waffle a bit longer? I'll waffle a bit longer. Just an extra 5 minutes. But last poem, so you can breathe a sigh of relief on that one. This is by John Sexton, and is the sonnet to the goddess of words. It's short. You led me to a room inside your head, and feeling drowsy, I lay down and died. You told me that I was not really dead, but no shouting could arouse me. You lied. I had a bag of omens from my mum, with whose magic I would be unsmothered. A bee, a golden hair, a chrysanthemum. The bee had flown, the hair grey, the flower withered, and even the heavy sweater my mammy knitted unravelled on a protruding rusty nail. And all those years of learning I regretted, my apprenticeship to you of no avail. I cannot wake up, but can only tread stealthily and rewind the unwound thread, which is about as bitter as any poet is ever likely to get about the futility of his service to the art of poetry. He obviously wasn't paying his bills at the time. But again, the weaving in of nature imagery with everything else. Some of this may be difficult to read, but you don't really need to go over it. Just to take into account, there's a lot. That's the key thing to bear in mind with this. In medieval Ireland, the Fili, the poets, went through a series of 7 ranks of training, from apprentice poet, the Fechlach, all the way to the master poet, the Olav. And Olav is still used in modern Gaelic as the word for a professor. So the professor poet, the master poet. At each rank, it determines from one of the old Irish manuscripts the number of poems that the individual must master. Think of this like a degree system. First year, second year, third year, etc., all the way 7 years worth. What you must learn and prove to your teacher you know in order to qualify as that rank of poet. Having qualified as that rank of poet, when you turn up to deliver poems in the royal court, your rank determines the fee you can charge. It's eminently practical. By the end of it, so we won't go over the whole lot, but by the end of it, you would have memorized over 500 stories and 250 types of meter in which you were expected to compose extempore off the top of your head, without the benefit of books. So you couldn't even say to the king, hang on a minute, while I go and look up how to write that one. I'll just Google it, give me a second. Couldn't do that. If you couldn't do it, you weren't worthy of the rank. Does beg the question, did the king necessarily know if you got it wrong? Just blag your way through, possibly some people did. But the master poets were renowned throughout the whole of Ireland, and Wales had an almost identical structure, but slightly different numbers of poems and stories at each level as to what they were expected to know. So this wasn't just spotty teenagers composing bad poetry in their bedroom. This was a master class in creating metered, structured, measured poetry and understanding of stories. So where does this leave us? Aside from Bury St Edmunds. There are Eisteddfodau cropping up all over the place, including Suffolk. It's not very well publicised, I'll grant you, but they do exist. Attempts at celebrating Welsh culture, Irish culture. There's one in Brittany celebrating Breton culture. The Bretons have had the same problem in that Paris likes everyone to speak French. But